thanks to everybody for joining us this evening in this online presentation and discussion. It's funny, years ago, before I ever thought about running for office, I always enjoyed going to candidate forums and fundraisers because it was great to mingle and meet other people and to talk to the candidates in person. And it's really kind of a bummer I don't get to do that as a candidate, that we're online, but it does allow us to do this and still connect. So I'm thankful for that. So I want to welcome and introduce my fellow panelists for tonight's discussion. Tom Begich, who is a state senator, who's our current minority leader, represents District J, and has authored some bills and done some work related to promoting renewable energy development in Alaska. And then Stephen Trimble, who is an independent candidate for State House in the representing District 22, that's the Sand Lake area, but also the founder and the CEO of Arctic Solar Ventures Corporation. So he's going to bring a kind of a business perspective to a discussion about renewable energy for tonight. So the general platform of this evening's event is each one of us will kind of give our kind of opening thoughts and spiel related to the topic. I'm going to be kind of holding a lot more of the conservation end of the discussion because that's a lot of my background. But a lot of this stuff does connect together. And then I'll pass it on to Senator Begich and then on to Stephen, and then from them each to kind of give their opening presentation. So, as a former lawyer, it was practicing law is what brought me up to Alaska. And one of the things you always do when you're a lawyer is you start with founding documents and constitutions and statutes to better understand the purpose for how things are supposed to be run. And when you have the fortune of, as an attorney, representing one of, at that time, he was one of our two surviving delegates to our state constitutional convention. Now he's the only one, but having the pleasure of representing Vic Fisher in court to defend our Constitution helped me be inspired to dig deeper into why we have the Constitution that we do. And one of the benefits we had of being the 49th state is seeing and learning from the mistakes and the successes that other states had in their founding documents. So that's what brings us to Article 8 of our Constitution, which is our natural resources provision. But before I get to that, I just want to highlight some things that William Egan covered in his speech to the State Constitutional Convention. This was towards the end of the convention when he's making his final push for statehood. And this was a speech that was delivered on February 5th, 1956. And he says, quote, "Many of the states now in the Union would be happy indeed if they could be endowed with Alaska's natural resources," end quote. And after that, he talks about how mismanagement of our fisheries by federal territorial managers had really plundered our fisheries. And one of the important things we needed to do is get control of those fisheries, and statehood would allow us to do that. And particularly to get control of those fisheries so they could rebound and add revenue to the state government. So a lot of what Article 8 of our Constitution drives at is how we use our resources for the benefit of the state. It talks about utilization, development, and conservation of all of our natural resources belonging to the state, including land and waters, for the maximum benefit of its people. That we use fish and wildlife and water resources for the common use. That replenishable resources belonging to the state should be utilized, developed, and maintained on a sustained yield principle. And that the legislature may provide for facilities, improvements, and services to assure greater utilization, development, reclamation, and settlement of lands, and to further utilize and develop fisheries, wildlife, and waters. So the legislature is called out specifically for having a role in managing and providing for use of our resources. So when we look back pre-statehood, one of the main things that was part of our history, post Treaty of Cession with Russia, was mining. With the gold rush, mining was a big part of our development as a territory. And then post-statehood, oil played a huge role as we developed our state and grew for our first 50 years, 60 years. So the kind of thing I want to talk about tonight is, what are we going to do for the next 50 or 60 years? What should be our focus on state resources and how we use them, and how we can use our renewable resources? Now, obviously, mining and oil are going to play a continuing role in our economy, but I think it's time to start building on our renewable resources, which can last in perpetuity if we manage them well. So I'm going to highlight some of the resources that I think are some of our big renewable resources that can contribute to our economy and to our revenue and our health and growth as a state. You know, first, we have the largest amount of national park lands of any state in the union. And in 2019, while nationwide national parks contributed 21 million to 21 billion in revenue to local gateway communities, Alaska has the second highest total, not per capita, but actual total number of dollars into the local economy from national parks at 1.5 billion annually. So that is something that we can manage sustainably that brings in money. BLM lands, even though they don't get as much visitation as national parks, they still get roughly 175,000 visits annually. People spend around 180 million in local economies, which brings in about 10 million in local and state revenue. The Division of Wildlife Conservation published a report in 2011 called The Economic Importance of Alaska's Wildlife, indicating that spending on hunting and wildlife viewing totaled about 3.4 billion in 2011 and generating 4.1 billion in economic activity in Alaska. Our annual seafood harvest is not only a huge part of our economy, but it's a huge part of what the United States consumes for seafood. We annually harvest around 5 to 6 billion pounds, accounting for about 60% of the total U.S. seafood harvests. And that value is about 2 billion ex-vessel and 4.5 billion wholesale. Now, but the things we have to wonder, though, as we move forward is, how does the management of our resources, not only these resources and continuing to manage them sustainably, tie in with what we need to do with climate change and thinking about other aspects of how we develop energy in the state? And I'll tease some questions out of that later as we get into the rest of the discussion. But now I've kind of given my opening spiel, and I want to hand it on to Senator Begich for his opening comments, and then off to Stephen Trimble. Senator Begich.
Thank you for that, Carl. I'm glad to be here supporting you, and I'm glad that you're going to be posting this so that others will be able to see this down the road as well. Because I think at the end of the day, after we finish this conversation, people are going to realize how important it is to be supporting you in this state Senate bid. I'm going to start from a place that you hinted at, and I'll be just a little stronger in a statement here that it's my belief that the future of Alaska is not oil. I do believe, as you said, that we'll have oil and we'll have some mining that'll continue, but the entire world has been turning away from oil for the last 2 decades, oil and gas in particular, and we're moving rapidly away from it. We've had all our eggs in the same basket for way too long. As you know, over the last few years, the largest source of income for the state of Alaska is actually a renewable resource. It's the permanent fund. It's a different kind of renewable resource, though, because it's not agricultural, it's not forest, it's not even esoteric like tourism. It's actually cash. Cash as a renewable resource is the only substantive way we'll be able to offset the decline in the direct tax results we get from tax income we get from oil and gas. So that, to me, is a number one issue here, that if we recognize we're moving away from an oil and gas future, then we have to be sure to maximize the size of the permanent fund so that it can reach a real dollar amount of anywhere between 80 and 120 billion, where it can then produce enough income that it will sustain state services for years to come. That said, what you've done is you've set the smorgasbord for why we're ideally suited to develop alternative energy resources, why we are ideally suited to develop our tourism resources, particularly because of the gift of so many national parks and state parks here, and why we have opportunities before us that we have to take advantage of both in terms of energy and in terms of conservation. So let me focus first on some of the energy issues and then briefly touch on conservation before I kick it over to Steve Trimble, or kick it back to you, I guess, and then you'll kick it over to Steve. So in terms of the alternative energy issues, Alaska was always a standout leader when it came to new technology. The Alascom network that was developed in the 70s took advantage of new technologies to develop telecommunications at a level that the country had not seen before. And then we exported that out. On the North Slope, we developed techniques for drilling and hydraulic fracking that, whether you like them or not, we developed them. We perfected those techniques and we exported them. What I think we're highly attuned to doing right now is exporting the ability to use localized alternative energy and to do so in a way that benefits not only our local communities and our small communities, but helps us train our workforce. Some examples that I would give is, since I'm a freshman still, it's hard to believe after 4 years, but it's a 4-year term, so I'm a freshman still. And in my first year, I reached out to the Tesla company because I knew they were looking at high storage and long-term storage batteries. And what I proposed to them was, I said to them, you can't affordably test your batteries in the lower 48 because the cost of gas, natural gas, is so low, and other alternatives. But you can do it here and actually effectively lower the cost of energy in communities where you could test your battery power by linking it with solar, in-stream hydro, biomass energy production, some biodiesel actually energy production as well as wind. Did I say wind? Wind and solar both. So the idea was to see if they could identify a community in rural Alaska where the price of diesel fuel was on average between $5.90 and $7.50 a diesel gallon. Now that is outrageous when you think about it. Here's a very quick example. The Lower Kuskokwim School District's energy costs are $5 million annually, or they were 2 years ago. That's the same as Mat-Su Boroughs District's energy costs, because of the cost of running your entire community on diesel, and not even running it efficiently on diesel, because you don't even run it at high power, because diesel runs best at high efficiencies. So the key was to work with Tesla to see if, one, we could find a community ready to convert, and two, a community that was willing, that already had some stranded electrons in the form of wind or solar power or other types of alternatives, and three, if you could create a smoothing effort or ability so that you didn't have to use the diesel all the time, but you could take advantage of long summer days and windy conditions to offset some of that, using longer and longer periods of time for storage on a battery. So Tesla bit, and it wasn't actually their West Coast that did, it was their Micronesian operation. And why? Because Alaskan rural villages are a lot like Micronesia. They're not connected by road to any other place. They're isolated. They can have a self-contained grid. They're not connected to a larger grid. And so that entity had the expertise, and you've seen some of that over the last 2 years in Australia and New Zealand. They've developed some of their battery testing in those areas for precisely the same reasons. So they're the ones that came up, and they've worked with a couple of our villages. We didn't use a lot of state resources. We used the office to convene them, bring them up, and make the connections. So that is part of the future. I've worked with school districts now, Carl, because what we're trying to do is, for juniors and seniors, is train them up in the technologies so that they can develop these localized solar, wind, and other technologies, import those technologies in, and potentially export their skill sets to the lower 48 at some point, or the rest of the world. Finally, if you can develop cheaper energy like a small village, and you can connect that village up with the internet through high-speed internet. We've fiber optic cable was dropped by quintillion all along the North Slope for free, and they're willing to do that all along the western and southwestern coast as well. That has already materially lowered the cost of internet services for the Nome School District by almost 2/3. So if you could actually link up, working in partnership with Alaska Native corporations, link up that high-speed internet along with cheaper energy and power our colder temperatures make isolated and individual server farms for companies like Google and other companies a very attractive opportunity. It also means that you can develop local internal businesses and be able to market and export your expertise, culturally appropriate expertise in some cases, to the rest of the world. So I think that the shift to alternative energies is the future. Finally, last thing, a couple of bills that I proposed would do some of this. They just get us started. They're just opening the door, and instead of the macro view that I just described, a kind of a micro view, but taking and retrofitting our state buildings of 5,000 square feet and greater so that they are energy efficient will save us in the long run literally hundreds of millions of dollars and reduce our deferred maintenance for some of these structures. We have a bill that would do that, wouldn't cost the state a dime because you're using private companies to do the retrofits and then pay themselves with the savings for 10 years. And then we reap the savings after that. Also, setting energy targets for uses of non carbon fuels. And I've worked with the governor on that bill. The governor's excited about it. And even though we're on opposite sides on so many things, he sees the future in an electric Alaska. And he sees breaking the dependency on oil and gas is something we can all agree on. So with that, I know there's more to talk about conservation, but I've already taken too much time. Let's pass this over to Steve Trimble. Carl, I'm back at you.
Thank you, Tom. That's some very excellent points, and I've taken some notes on some things I want to follow up as we discuss later. Now I'm going to pass it on to Stephen Trimble again, who is a candidate for State House for District 22, an independent candidate, and a business guy with the alternative energy world. So, Stephen.
Thanks, Carl, and thank you for your comments, Tom. We had the privilege of getting to work with Tom when our business was in his district downtown, where we co-located to our warehouse now. But thank you for supporting us, Tom, since the beginning and engaging with us as an industry. You've been a huge champion. It's so great to see so many familiar faces tonight. Jamie, Erik, LB, Doug, and Wendy. Hi. I'm sorry I'm coming to you from my car. After a day at the office and campaigning, we had Pee Wee learn to skate here at the Diamond Center for our little boys, 6 and 4. And I ran out to my car for this call. So it's one of the few times I get to really hang out with those guys right now. So thank you all for having me, and sorry for my background. So I want to talk a little bit. I'm gonna so as Carl mentioned, I'm running for State House in District 22, Sand Lake, as an independent. I'm going to take my candidate hat off now and talk about the business side of solar and some of the things we've been able to do, and the trends we're seeing and what we're hopeful for in the future. So we set out with a very simple idea in 2014 to start our company, Arctic Solar Ventures. And that idea was, how do we capture some of the economic activity that's happening with clean energy and bring it here and do it our way? And that was the simple idea. And so, we got together and we said, okay, how can we impact the most people we can? Focus on the population centers, focus on driving that cost of power down, and taking from this wonderful menu of things that have been tried and tested and failed and succeeded other places. And I think that's something we're so good at doing in Alaska. And we have to remember that we have so much opportunity to pick and choose from things that have worked well and learn from others' mistakes. So that was our basic mission. And so then we had to convince everyone that solar made sense up here. And the very first thing that we still deal with to this day is cold, dark, solar. How does it mesh? How does it compute? Seeing that sort of opinion and baseline knowledge change over the past 6 years, I can tell you that, it's a testament to the growth that we've experienced as a company. And, we've grown 1,680% in the past 3 years. So it's been a race to just keep up with that. And we're actually named one of the 500 fastest growing businesses in the United States, and the eighth fastest growing energy company in the United States. And I don't say that to be self-serving and talk about our business specifically. I say that to speak about the opportunity, the economic opportunity that solar presents here. Another thing we were very specific with focusing on was, as Tom mentioned and as Carl mentioned, not alienating traditional resource development, and recognizing the place that has. And so we were very specific in the way that we messaged around solar to avoid the partisan pitfalls often associated with climate change. And we made solar about the economics. And that is what really opened things up, is making it about the lower electricity rate, making it about how well it performs financially, making it about how we've optimized it to perform here. Those are all sort of core Alaskan values of innovation that we've practiced since statehood. And we've been able to do some innovative things, like we install and design an awful lot of vertical solar arrays. So you see them on walls. Very simple thing. How do we keep snow off solar panels? Mount them on a wall. And that's something we can do on almost any building in Alaska. That's the power, and that's the potential. And they're high-paying jobs, and we can bring those jobs here, and we can generate those jobs here ourselves. And all it takes is a will to do it, and a will to see it through. And there's so much that can be done on a policy front there. I often veer towards the glass half full approach, which, I like to tell people, like, the reason I, born and raised in Anchorage, have stayed here and never left is because we have so much opportunity. We have so many chances to innovate and do great things and bring those innovations that have been successful elsewhere here. And so, I can tell you that, the results of those efforts is that, we have over 2.5 megawatts of operating solar in South Central Alaska. What does that mean? Hundreds of homes. I think we just looked at it the other day, and we have about 300 homes we've brought online with solar. And even at the residential level, we've got it to the point where those systems on people's rooftops are producing electricity at cheaper than the utility rate right now. When you look at it on the commercial side, you can take a building like the Egan Center that we did for the city last year. It was a competitive public bid process, and we had to participate in that. By no means was there any type of favoritism shown with that. But the city had a simple concept, and that was, how do we reduce the operating costs of this asset that we own? And they specifically targeted the energy use with the Egan Center. And that system on the top of the Egan Center generates power at 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is astonishing. That's an astonishing price anywhere. It's exceptionally astonishing that we're able to do that here. And I think this June, just to give you guys an example, that system generated $7,500 of electricity. just in 1 month. And so, the impacts of those savings go directly to the bottom line, of government, for government owned entities, for businesses and for people. And those are dollars that can be injected into the economy elsewhere, because we're creating those savings locally and generating that domestic electricity here. When you look at our resource, I tell people my dream is that when you talk about Alaska natural resources, the sun is included in that list. And it's pretty fascinating when you really start, like with so many things, you really start to look at the facts, and you're surprised. For instance, months of March through October, we have more what are called peak sun hours than most of California. That's not something most Alaskans think about in the dead of winter. Because we have, a primitive but operational net metering policy in the state, we're able to overproduce in the times of abundant sunlight, which is when we have over 12 hours of sunlight a day. And we're able to shift that overproduction that goes to the utilities, and they supply that power elsewhere. And because it's distributed, and because arguably it is costing less to produce, they're getting distribution benefits out of it as well. And we can shift that production to the winter months when we have less available sunlight. And so, we've just barely scratched the surface here. There's so much that can be done from a policy front. There's so much that can be done from a job creation front. I often think about our veteran resource here, specifically in Anchorage and all of Alaska. We have a huge military presence, and we have, a huge number of veterans that are, when they get out of the military, they're looking to start their second career. There's a massive federal program available for job training for solar for veterans, and we're not taking advantage of it here. Those are hundreds of millions of federal dollars, nationwide, that we could be participating in Alaska to train people for this new generation of jobs. Most solar installers and field personnel, make $25 to $40 an hour. Those are good paying jobs. Those are professional level jobs. That's $75,000, $80,000 a year. So we can do it. We've proven it. And we've just barely scratched the surface. And so I hope this is inspiring to you as it has been to me to be a part of it, and see sort of the forefront of hope with Alaskans every day. People ask us a lot about how do we view the trends in the economy? What do we see? All we see is people that want to make a difference for their fellow Alaskans. So it's a great place to be, and we can bring so many more people there with us. I'm happy to talk about, all kinds of questions related to the business model or economics of how we do what we do, but I'm so glad that all of you are here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And again, thank you, Tom. Some of the things both of you have talked about tied in some of the specific questions and comments that, one, dealing with cost savings as a means of reducing, budget expenses in, administration and operation of buildings for a state government. We've covered that. Mm-hmm. But I also want to, in my own initial discussion, I forgot to mention one of our huge land bases that we have that's part of our economy, and that's our state parks. So we have 121 units in our state park system, You get 4 million visitors annually. Now, 80% of those are Alaskans, but there are a lot of facilities related to those state parks, and a lot of those are in remote locations. So certainly, renewable energy can be a part of operating state park units. But the other thing I want to bring up related to state parks, that's something we have to do better as a state, is as a business operator, we have to get a commercial use permit to operate in the state parks. And I learned earlier this year that basically the legislature has given DNR state parks the directive to become completely self-funding through fees. I found this out after I learned that our commercial use fees were going to be raised 6,000% pursuant to this directive from the legislature. But I think that's an area where we're missing out when we cut our state parks so much. And I'm wondering how much renewable energy could be a part of managing our state park budgets. Just kind of throw that out into the ether. But I want to get back to job creation specifically, and how we can do this more so as a statewide thing when it comes to renewable energy. Because one of the things you often hear about, one of the concerns about expanding and growing more renewable energy employment sector and industry is the loss of fossil fuel jobs. But here in Alaska, I think we're uniquely situated where it's not either or the other. We can do both at the same time, because there are a lot of areas in Alaska where there's no fossil fuel related jobs, but there's a lot of opportunity to create new jobs that didn't exist previously with renewable energy infrastructure. I've had the pleasure of visiting the Tizimina hydroelectric plant, which provides power to New Haven, Non-Dalton, and Iliamna. Really cool facility, non-destructive. Completely takes natural use of the water flow, so it doesn't dam a river. It doesn't create any obstructions to fish passage or anything else. So it's a really cool facility, and we have several of our villages taking the lead on renewable energy. Kodiak is about 95, not a village, small town, 95% completely renewable. Michelle and I visited Wrangell earlier this summer, and they're 100% renewable, and their power source feeds power to other nearby communities in the southeast. So what can we do at the state level, at a policy level, to help our rural communities more in those areas? Aside from, Tom, you mentioned the bills you've sponsored, but I'm curious what else we can do, and how could that tie into helping our state economy grow, and then adding more revenue into our state budget?
Well, let me, before I answer that, let me just 2 quick points. My solar panels, which I put on in October, reduced my electric bill at this house by 2/3 this summer. So for whatever that's worth, I want to just put that shout out, for your private business there, Steve. So, that to me is critical and important, and I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't seen his presentation. So I forgot to say that earlier. I want to talk about your parks idea too, Carl, because I think that's really important. And it ties into the employment question. I'm going to segue out of that to what we can do to make rural communities more responsible, and frankly more viable is really the word, because we have energy migrants ending up on our streets here, and from rural Alaska ending up on our streets here, and so they're disassociated from their home communities. They're disassociated here. It doesn't serve anyone well, and lowering the cost of energy is a critical component to making rural villages habitable and livable. I mentioned earlier that if indeed you work with the school districts in rural areas and you develop a grid simultaneously, you're not training to do what Steve's company does, which is set the structures up. You're training people to maintain those structures, and those can be very high-paying jobs. And they don't require you to go off to college necessarily. They require you to have strong technical skills. So, we've always talked about having 2 paths in our school system, one that goes to college, or one that allows you to be a successful, productive adult who doesn't go to college, one way or the other. Well, the third path is to develop skill sets that would be useful in your hometown and can help move you into the new economy. So I think that that's one thing, and I go back to, I think we can build a workforce, and that's good for the economy. Secondarily, just the shifting of our grids as we move toward renewables in these communities entails the creation of jobs. There's a role for the state in finding and leveraging resources, whether through ADA or the Industrial Development and Authority or through other processes to help that move forward. I propose to bill to add an additional 10 mil opportunity to tax oil and gas property. Why? Because for the oil industry, that was a stable, known effort at taxing them, as opposed to the price of oil or per barrel tax deduction that they might get, those kinds of things, which are unpredictable. That's a predictable thing. What's the property value? And so raising it 10 mils, but then what do you do with that money? My proposal would put some of that money in the Alternative Energy Conservation Fund. Some of it would go into community, what do we call it? Revenue sharing with community revenue sharing or the community bank. So the idea would be you could use some of that money to retool. So that's, in other words, subsidize, the state has a role in subsidizing a shift to a new energy economy. It's not the full role, it's a partial role. The community is going to have to step up to that too. I've even proposed to the energy cooperative that we look at PCE not as a cash cow like per se, but knowing we have $1 billion there, that money's used to offset energy costs now. What if a community elected, took a vote, and determined that it wanted to use PCE resources that would be prorated to its size of its community to convert their community to alternative energy? Now that would mean they wouldn't need the subsidy anymore, and they would have moved to cheaper energy source. So these are some of the things we do have the capacity. Now that's a third rail in legislative politics, talking about PCE. I would never do that without full support from my rural compatriots, but it is an innovative way of looking at things. Finally, we're leaving on the table, going back to your parks issue, we're leaving on the table up to $4 million this year that was available through the Land and Water Conservation Fund that could be used to improve parks because we didn't put up our state match, nor did we have a state coordinator in that position as of today. Today is the last day. That money will expire because it's the end of the federal fiscal year. There is a bill that passed this year that will create a $9 million annual stream to Alaska for use in state parks to build and improve our state parks. We could be converting all of them to alternative energy. That's jobs for Alaska right there. We could be improving those parks, which are jobs for the future because it's a tourism economy. $9 million a year for the next decade. That's $90 million. But we have to come up with a state match. So I'm working on legislation now that will create a quasi-governmental entity to collect the match, because I'm fairly certain we're not going to get it from this administration. So knowing that, we have to create a mechanism. And I'll work with the governor to say, I get it, man, you can't put the money up. Let me create a mechanism so we can capture this $9 million in federal funds and use that money to improve and develop our park system here locally, our state parks, to make them attractive. And last thing here, you mentioned the oil and gas employment and how do you move away from that, and people talk about that. Look, the bulk of our oil and gas employment doesn't even live here. We've lost so many jobs, thousands and thousands of jobs, because the oil and gas companies have never fulfilled those commitments. And all the new discoveries are high. It's easier to refine, and that the West Coast refineries are not yet tooled to accept. So you have to export that oil and gas product. That means we're always going to have a high-end product that we can continue to provide. It's just not going to be the future. Those jobs that we now have are pretty much the sustainable jobs of the oil and gas industry. We've shed so many of them. So that's a canard. That's a false argument. Set it aside. It's not about Alaskan residents. That's about somebody making a lot of profit. What I want to see us do is find real and meaningful jobs like Stephen has done for Alaskans right here, where they're doing things, where they're developing skill sets that are for the 21st century, not for the 20th century or the 19th. Then that's where I'm going with this stuff. What can the state do? We can promote that match for the state parks money. We can promote alternative energy systems. We can use our oil and gas resources to develop those systems, and we can truly, truly, truly innovate our rural communities into the 21st century, lowering their costs of frankly living there, the costs of living in those communities.
And actually, just a quick follow-up, I was intrigued by your suggestion of using the power cost equalization money if villages elect to use it so to convert to renewable energy. And doesn't that also in the long run help with our budget deficits? Because if those communities do convert, then that lessens and possibly even eliminates their need to receive PCE funds.
Well, yeah, the idea would be exactly that, that if indeed what you'd have to do is you'd have to have a feasible plan and a structure for it. And you'd say, okay, based on this conversion process we're talking about and this shift of grid, we believe that the price of the PCE is based on that price of fuel and the reduction of the price of fuel costs that you pay. And by the way, schools are exempt from the PCE subsidy, and the reason why is without the school money coming into our small electric cooperative, they would go broke because of the debt load. The debt load that they incurred to build those diesel plants, so those diesel facilities. So you actually have to be very careful how you do it to make sure that it does what you intend it to do, which is to lower the cost of energy. That would break the dependency on the state having to subsidize the energy, but it would also free up the resources at the local level to be able to develop their own economy. So the short answer is yes, it would. The long answer is it would take time to get there, and so you must do it in a planful way. And that means you got to preserve PCE until the plan is developed, because otherwise PCE will be rated, that money will be used to just treading water and doing the same old, same old. And I refused to go along with that kind of approach.
And I think that when it comes to investments, these are things we have to look at as long term. We have done short term management of this state for too long, and we need to shift to long term investments and looking at them as a way of eliminating problems that have plagued us for a long period of time.
That's exactly.
Stephen, I want to give you a chance to chime in on Tom's comments, or add anything if you have to add something.
Absolutely, Carl. Thank you. And again, thank you, Tom. I think the thing I would have to add there is that, these renewable energy investments they have very predictable returns, from, both from being an asset owner, but also an investor. And that is something that, we can take advantage of as a state. If you're able to make investments that, deliver 10 to 11% predictable returns, that is something that can be generating additional state revenue. And that is something that we can use further to additionally capitalize on that resource. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, is the predictability of these investments. And there's a lot of different ways and places that you can play and operate in these. Another thing that I always like to talk about is all of the support services to our industry as well. We have probably 50 subcontractors that we use on a regular basis. That is a hell of a lot of economic activity and revenue generation. That's not primary, it's secondary. It's working with architects, it's electrical engineers, it's structural engineers, it's electricians, it's all of our field personnel are union carpenters, for example. There's all of these ancillary services that benefit from the economic production that and that's a really important thing to remember as well.
That's an excellent point, Stephen, because kind of one of my missions in life is to diversify our Alaska economy, so when we have pitfalls in one sector, it doesn't drag the whole economy down. And having predictability and stability is important not only for people to be able to plan for what their energy costs will be, but for communities, both local and statewide, for us to have an economy that has sectors we can rely on as being stable. That's a really great point to bring up. I want to throw in a couple of comments that people have made as part of registration that don't fit into this specific conversation, but I want to raise them and just kind of note and acknowledge them, and then kind of switch this back to renewable energy as how we adapt or even combat climate change in Alaska. So first, a couple of folks raised points about when talking about conservation and conserving some of our special places, like the Tongass National Forest and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, both of them are special for the habitat that they provide for the wildlife and fisheries that Alaskans rely on for subsistence, for sport hunting and sport fishing, for tourism economy and all that. But they do also play a role in Alaska and how it combats climate change. And in the one case, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, bringing all of that, carbon product out of the ground and putting it into the air, contributing to climate change. But also the Tongass National Forest itself, being our largest national forest in the United States, and a huge contributor to combating greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, I'll just have to state, there's not a lot directly the state legislature can do about that. In that I'm back to me being a lawyer, and I've actually read Section 4 of our Statehood Act and Article 12, Section 12 of our Constitution, which kind of relays out, when we become a state, we kind of forever waive claim, title, and interest to federal lands and how they're managed. But the legislature does play a role. We always do. I'm speaking prematurely, but the legislature does play a role in sending a message to our congressional delegation, to our national leadership on what we want to do with federal lands. But so I'm just going to just plant that there. Don't really expect any comment from Stephen or Tom on that. But let's swing this back. We've got about 5 minutes left for the discussion, and then we'll have some final announcements. We're going to go a little bit long, so everybody just bear with us because we started a few minutes late. I want to bring this back again. Alaska being the kind of ground zero of climate change in the United States, and us seeing a lot of changes already, not only from coastal erosion affecting villages and villages losing traditional storage methods like permafrost lockers to cold store food, and creating infrastructure and engineering challenges with how permafrost is affecting our ability to build structures and have been maintained for a long period of time. But how do we see renewable energies fitting into kind of being the leading weapon that we have as a state to control our destiny and climate change locally?
Well, I guess I'll start again. It's you sometimes feel helpless in the face of climate change because you watch 3 villages sink into the ocean. I've spent a lot of time working in the Kivalina process and trying to figure out how to recite the Kivalina community. The whole community has to be moved. Debate over a school led to the debate over that, and we talked about using the school as maybe a starting point for rebuilding a new community. But that's really an example of what happens because of climate change. And here's what it really leads to, Carl, and why I'm such a proponent of alternative energies and reduction in oil and gas use, is because the world is going to move away from oil and gas. China set targets this year that are, they briefly went back to some coal use, and they briefly went back to some use of oil and gas or increased oil and gas. But this whole process of COVID-19 is giving us a new perspective on oil and gas usage and the dramatic result of not using vehicles and what that has done to the air in China in particular. So it's changed the consuming market for the product. And that is the best thing that could have happened in terms of addressing climate change, because it forced people to think about stuff differently. I don't know about you or any of you individually, but I'm filling up once a month, if that much, where I used to fill up twice a month. And that's a complete cause of COVID-19. So what that's done is changed my habits. And that's part of the hard part when you deal with climate change. You got to change people's habits. So in the long run, we should see changes because the oil and gas industry is already shifting to alternatives and renewables, and we have to be aware that those things are happening. But that doesn't stop the pace of climate change. Climate change continues. The world is getting warmer, and that has an impact on things like permafrost. You're not going to be able to solve that problem because you can't remake permafrost or cool down the planet. So what you have to do is ensure that those communities can, when they do shift to technology and choose a refrigerator over a permafrost bank, that they have the infrastructure to do it and the asset ability to do it because they have an economy. When your village unemployment is at 30+%, when 50% of your population is under the age of 21, you have a recipe for disaster. Climate change goes even further because that's a recipe for economic disaster. So you have to find a way to solidify those economies. And I've had members of the Valley delegation, Carl, tell me, well, it's rural Alaska, and they've said it on the floor of the Senate. That's their choice. They made the choice. We don't need those communities. They forget that the reason the service economies of Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Matsu thrive today, they thrive today because we service those communities. And there's a symbiote, and then the people will shout, oh, but government shouldn't be spending money on this stuff. This is private enterprise. They forget every construction company in Alaska, major construction company, would go out of business if it wasn't for the state funding deferred maintenance, building new schools, building roads. Basically, we have a symbiotic relationship here. So we have an obligation as a state to help those local economies flourish. And that happens when you lower the cost of energy, you increase connectivity, and that provides opportunity. So that's, in my very brief, sort of time in the Senate, that's what I've tried to focus on because I think that's the future. I think that's our contribution to reducing climate change, in my belief.
And if I may jump in, Tom and Carl, this is where things get really interesting, right? Because I hear the argument all the time. We don't have enough of a population in Alaska to, affect local climate change. So what we do doesn't matter, and that's just total BS. We actually track this every year at our company, and in 2019 alone, we removed the equivalent of 3,500,000 driven miles of gasoline emissions from the air. And again, it's just, we're just scratching the surface, and that's not insignificant. So imagine what we could do with that at scale.
That is an excellent point. Excellent point.
Well, I think this is a good stopping point. Again, as much as I would love to have had an entirely different conversation about more of kind of my pitch, we kind of sandwiched both of these issues together, the conservation and the renewable energy, together in one just because of lack of time in the campaign. But I do think they are related. We have, for kind of, I guess, the youth of our state, focused a lot on the non-renewable natural resources as how to grow our state. And I really think that the renewable natural resources we have, the ones that we can manage sustainably, is the future of our state. So I want to thank again Senator Tom Begich and Stephen Trimble for joining us tonight. It's been a privilege to have this chat with you and have everybody join us here in the Zoom and also listening out there in the Facebook world. I'm going to pass this on back to Heather for closing remarks and information. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Senator Begich and Stephen, for joining us. I am going to link to Stephen Trimble's campaign website in the chat in case anyone wanted to check out his campaign. And Senator Begich, did you have any pluggables you wanted to plug?
Oh no, I'm plugging both of you. I'm plugging Carl Johnson because when he comes down to the Senate, he's going to be part of a leadership team where he's going to be maybe he'll be the prime sponsor of that parks bill, because that's right up your alley, Carl. I hadn't thought about that at the time, and so I'm going to plug Carl Johnson, and I just gave a contribution to Steve Trimble as well. So
that is the perfect answer, Senator. Thank you very much.
Paid for by Carl Johnson for Alaska. P.O. Box 11022, Anchorage, Alaska 99511.